I parked a block away from the town hall because I didn't want anyone to notice me slipping in. The September evening carried that small town chill that makes the street lamps glow a little sharper. From the outside, the hall looked ordinary. The same brick walls and neon sign I had seen since I was a child. But inside, I knew half the town had gathered to celebrate my mother's 65th birthday. I told myself I would only stay long enough to leave the card on the gift table, maybe nod at a few familiar faces, and then drive back home before anyone cared I was there. When I stepped into the lobby, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses hit me like a wall. The place smelled of sheet cake, fried chicken, and cheap coffee brewing in big metal urns. I adjusted my jacket, smoothed my hair, and tried to look smaller than I felt. Everyone seemed to have someone to talk to, cousins leaning in over plates, neighbors swapping stories about football games. I caught a few glances that slid off me like I was a stranger. My mother had always been the kind of woman who loved a crowd, and she was in her element that night. I saw her near the stage, her silver hair curled just right, her red dress catching the light every time she turned. She held court among the mayor, the banker, and the local high school coach, laughing loud enough for everyone to hear. For a second I wondered if she would soften when she spotted me, maybe smile the way she used to when I was a little girl, holding up a perfect report card. Instead, the moment her eyes landed on me, she paused, tipped her head, and let her voice carry across the room. "Only important people belong here, not you." It was said like a joke, but the kind that slices deep. The laughter around her faltered, replaced by the sound of forks, scraping plates, and a chair sliding back. My face burned, and my chest tightened, as though the air had been sucked out of the hall. I forced a half smile, the kind you put on when you know there is no winning, and clutched the envelope in my hand until it bent at the corners. People looked down at their food or shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice, but silence lingered long enough to make sure everyone had. I turned toward the door, my stomach knotted, and my vision swimming. Leaving was the kindest option, the least messy. I told myself it did not matter, that I had survived worse in quieter ways. My shoes clicked against the wooden floor as I moved faster, eager to escape before the sting in my eyes betrayed me. Each step felt heavier than the last, carrying not only the weight of that moment but of years of being dismissed, overlooked, and made smaller than I was. Just as I reached the edge of the crowd, a hand touched my shoulder. Firm but gentle, steady in a way that made the room stop breathing. I turned and saw her, Senator Olivia Grant, tall in a navy suit. The same woman who had once stood beside me during late nights at a disaster relief center. The one who had written letters of support when no one else had. Her presence cut through the tension like light pouring into a darkened room. "Ma'am, this way," she said, her voice calm, but carrying to every corner of the hall. Every head turned. The band that had been warming up lowered their instruments. Conversations froze mid-sentence. My mother's smile collapsed into something thin and pale. The air shifted, as if the town itself realized the story they thought they knew was about to change. I stood frozen, caught between the humiliation of the moment and the startling rush of vindication that someone, finally, was leading me toward a place where I was not small at all. I grew up in a small town in Indiana where Friday nights revolved around football. My brother Michael was the kind of kid everyone knew would be a star. He had broad shoulders, quick feet, and a smile that drew people in. My mother, Patricia, lived for those games. She stood on the sidelines in her red jacket, clapping so hard her rings clicked together, shouting his name as if he were the only reason the team took the field. At home, the trophies lined our mantel like a shrine. Michael's jerseys hung in frames on the wall, each number carefully preserved. I remember standing in the hallway with my honor roll certificate in my hands, waiting for her to notice, waiting for her to smile at me the way she smiled at him. She glanced once, said, "That's nice," and returned to polishing the glass over his medals. The paper sagged in my grip, and I folded it away in a drawer where no one else would see it. I was the kind of child who found comfort in books and in helping others. I volunteered at the library, read to younger kids, and joined a group that packed meals for families who had less. Those things filled me with quiet pride, but at home they barely registered. My mother brushed them off as hobbies, nothing compared to touchdowns under bright lights. She would tell me, "Michael makes this family proud," as if the rest of us were simply there to clap. Still, I kept going. I learned not to expect praise, not to chase it. Instead, I poured myself into small victories, the kind no one clapped for. When my teacher said I had a gift for explaining science to classmates, I carried that memory like a hidden medal. When a neighbor hugged me after I helped her clean up her yard, I tucked that gratitude deep in my chest. Being invisible hurt, but it also shaped me. It taught me to keep steady, to find strength in places that were not loud or obvious. I longed for my mother's recognition, but when it didn't come, I built my own kind of resilience. Even then, I think I knew my worth wasn't measured by applause, though part of me still ached for it. That ache never really left. It followed me into adulthood, into every room where I felt smaller than I was, reminding me where the fracture began. When it came time to choose a path, I knew I was never going to follow the rhythm of Friday night lights. I wanted a life where my hands could make a difference, where the hours I gave mattered to someone who had nothing else. That is why I chose public health. It was not glamorous. It did not come with trophies or newspaper headlines, but it gave me something far greater than applause. One of my earliest assignments took me south during the chaos of Hurricane Katrina. I stood in gymnasiums, turned into shelters, with cots lined up wall to wall, and children crying in corners. The air smelled of damp clothes and fear. My job was simple on paper. Just keep people safe, treat wounds, and pass out supplies. In reality, it meant staying awake long after my body begged for rest, sitting beside strangers, and reminding them they were not alone. Every thank you whispered, in exhaustion, felt heavier than a medal. Years later, I worked on rural vaccination campaigns. We drove down cracked county roads to schools where paint peeled from the walls and kids wore hand-me-downs 2 sizes too big. I held their little arms steady, explaining gently why the needle was needed. Mothers thanked me with eyes that carried more gratitude than words could hold. I watched illness rates drop and new lives had been spared. That was the kind of scoreboard I cared about. At home, though, none of it seemed to count. My mother would ask about Michael's new job or his son's football tryouts, then turn to me with a polite smile and a quick change of subject. When I tried to share about the vaccination project, she said, "That's nice. But when will you get a real career?" Her words stung, but I refused to let them erase what I knew to be true. I carried pride quietly, in the same way I carried exhaustion after long nights of work. It was the kind of pride that didn't demand an audience. It was steady, built from the faces of people I had helped, the hands I had held, and the lives that continued because I showed up. My family might never see it, but I knew the worth of what I had chosen. That knowledge kept me moving forward, even when their silence tried to drag me back. The town hall looked the same as it always had, a squat brick building with a neon sign that buzzed faintly against the evening sky. Trucks and sedans filled the gravel lot, and through the windows I could see the blur of people moving, carrying plates and laughing. My chest tightened as I walked toward the door, the gift envelope tucked in my hand like a pass I was not sure would get me in. The voices inside spilled out, warm and loud, but none of it felt like it belonged to me. When I stepped into the lobby, the smell of coffee and frosting hit first. The tables were covered in sheet cakes with thick icing that was already starting to sag under the lights. Along the walls hung banners and streamers in cheerful colors, the kind you buy in bulk and tape up without much thought. Folding chairs were arranged in circles, filled with neighbors leaning in close, whispering behind polite smiles. I caught fragments of conversations, laughter that seemed to pause when I passed. I knew most of the faces. They were people who had seen me grow up, people who remembered Michael's touchdowns and my mother's proud shouts from the sidelines. They glanced at me now with expressions that carried curiosity, pity, or something sharper. I pulled my jacket closer and kept moving, pretending not to notice. My shoes clicked too loud against the polished floor, each step making me feel more like an intruder in a place where I should have felt at home. The gift table sat near the corner, covered in wrapping paper prints of balloons and ribbons. I clutched the envelope a little tighter, thinking if I could just slide it into the pile and leave, I could escape the weight pressing against my ribs. The hall felt smaller than it was, the air thicker, every sound magnified. The clink of a fork against a plate, the scrape of a chair leg, the hush that followed me like a shadow. I reached the table and set the envelope down, my hand shaking just enough to make me steady it with the other. For a moment, I stared at it. The small square of paper that was supposed to stand in for love I had stopped trying to prove. I turned toward the exit, already rehearsing the quick smile I would give anyone who stopped me. My whole body ached to leave. To step outside into the night air where I could breathe, without feeling the weight of so many eyes. It felt like the only way to keep the night from cutting any deeper. I had just set the envelope on the gift table when I felt her eyes on me. My mother stood near the sheet cake with a glass of punch in her hand, surrounded by her circle of friends. Her laugh carried above the crowd, sharp and rehearsed, the same laugh I had grown up hearing whenever Michael's name came up. She spotted me, tilted her head slightly, and I braced for whatever was coming. Only important people are invited, not you. Her voice was light, almost playful, but it was designed to carry. Conversations nearby stumbled and stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Chairs creaked as people shifted, not sure where to look. My stomach dropped, and for a moment it felt like the air had been sucked out of the hall. I tried to keep my face still, but the heat rising to my cheeks gave me away. I forced a small smile as if it were nothing, as if words like that could bounce off me. Inside, I felt the familiar sting, the one that had trailed me since childhood. I heard whispers from the back, someone clearing their throat too loudly. Another person pretending to check their phone. Every sound stretched long and awkward, echoing louder than it should have. My mother turned back to her friends, her half-smile signaling the joke was over, but the damage lingered. People avoided my eyes, busying themselves with their plates or napkins. A woman at the next table glanced at me quickly, then looked down, guilt flickering across her face. I stood frozen, my hands tight at my sides, until instinct told me the only way out was forward. I straightened my shoulders, not because I felt strong, but because I had learned that leaving with dignity was the only armor I had left. I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to keep each step measured. The gift was already on the table. My presence was not wanted, and she had made sure everyone knew it. I turned toward the door, my pulse loud in my ears. The hall seemed to lean in, pressing against my back, reminding me of every time I had been made small in this family. My shoes clicked against the floor as I moved toward the exit, the sound breaking the silence that still clung to the room. Each step felt like a final sentence, a choice to walk away before the humiliation could cut any deeper. I was halfway to the door when I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of touch that told me to stop without saying a word. I turned and saw Senator Olivia Grant, tall and composed, her presence commanding every inch of the hall without raising her voice. The chatter that had begun to return after my mother's remark died instantly. Forks were set down. Even the band in the corner lowered their instruments. "Ma'am, this way," she said, and the room shifted with her words. They carried weight, the kind that made people sit straighter without knowing why. My breath caught as she guided me a few steps toward the center of the room. People's eyes followed, confusion flickering into realization. The woman who had once been my mentor, the one who had seen my work up close, was standing beside me, in full view of everyone who had just watched me be dismissed. The senator looked out over the crowd before speaking again. "I came tonight, not for a party, but to recognize someone who has given more to this country than most will ever know. Sarah Whitman has been working in public health and emergency response for years, often in the hardest conditions imaginable." Her voice was even calm, but it cut through the silence like a bell. I felt the air thicken around me. Whispers rose from the tables, then stopped when she lifted a hand. When Hurricane Katrina struck, Sarah spent weeks in shelters, treating injuries, handing out supplies, and comforting families who had lost everything. She was there long after the cameras left. She worked in rural towns where children had never seen a doctor, bringing vaccinations that saved lives. Her efforts did not make the front page, but they changed the course of countless families. I glanced at my mother. Her face had drained of color, her smile frozen in place. She shifted her glass from one hand to the other, gripping it tight as if it could anchor her. For once, she had no words. Around her, friends who had laughed minutes earlier now leaned forward, watching the scene unfold. Senator Grant reached into her bag and pulled out a folder with an embossed seal. She held it up so the nearest tables could see. This is a citation from the Department of Health and Human Services, awarded just last month, recognizing Sarah Whitman for outstanding service in public health and humanitarian relief. It acknowledges not only her skill but her courage, her leadership, and her unwavering compassion. A murmur swept through the hall. The mayor straightened in his chair. A veteran at the back took off his cap and held it against his chest. Even the coach who had coached Michael years ago nodded slowly, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The senator turned toward me and smiled, her eyes steady and kind. "Sarah, your work has saved lives and lifted communities. You have carried people through their darkest days with nothing more than your strength, your knowledge, and your heart. Tonight, it is time your hometown understands who you are." Applause began hesitantly, then grew until the room shook with it. I stood frozen, my throat tight, my palms damp. Years of silence and dismissal pressed against me, and now the weight lifted all at once, replaced by a rush of air that made me feel taller than I had ever stood. My mother stayed seated, her eyes darting between me and the senator, her mouth opening but no sound escaping. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, as though the words she had thrown at me had circled back and found her instead. I almost pitied her, but the pride rising in my chest was stronger. The senator let the applause fade before she spoke again. "Service is not about being on a guest list. It is about showing up when no one else will. It is about doing what is right when no one is clapping. That is what Sarah has done. And tonight, we acknowledge her with gratitude." The hall was silent again, but it was not the heavy silence of shame. It was reverence. I stood in the center of it, no longer shrinking, no longer invisible. The same town that had seen me as an afterthought was now forced to see the truth. And for the first time, I did not feel small at all. When the applause finally faded and the night carried on, I slipped out into the cool air. The neon glow of the town hall hummed behind me, but inside me something had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like peace. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of proving myself. My steps on the pavement were lighter, as though I had set down a burden I had been carrying since childhood. I thought of my father, Richard Whitman, and the words he gave me before he passed. "Do the right thing when nobody's clapping." He was not a man of long speeches, but he understood the kind of character that grows in silence. Those words had carried me through long nights in shelters, through endless paperwork, through moments when recognition felt like it belonged to everyone else. That night in the hall, when the senator spoke, I realized those words had been alive in me all along. The humiliation I had felt minutes earlier still lingered, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it stood in sharp contrast to the pride that followed, making the moment even clearer. I saw how easy it is for people to measure worth by the wrong yardstick, by applause and spotlights, by who sits at which table. My mother's sentence had stung because it carried the weight of years, but the senator's voice reminded me that truth does not bend to someone else's measure. I carried that truth home with me. I carried it like a steady rhythm in my chest, a reminder that dignity is not something others give or take away. It is something you claim by how you live, by the choices you make when no one is watching. My work had never been about recognition, but standing there in front of my town, I realized how deeply I had longed for it to be seen. That night it was, and the air returned to my lungs in a way I did not know I had been missing. Looking back, I do not see the party as a night of shame. I see it as the night the story changed. It was no longer about who was invited to a room. It was about what kind of life I had lived and what kind of person I had become. My mother may never understand, and that is a loss she will have to carry. For me, the lesson is simple and steady. Important is not a guest list. Important is living a life of service and kindness. That truth is enough to carry me forward, through the next quiet room, the next long night, the next chance to show up for someone who needs me. And if no one claps, I will still know who I am. That is the gift I walked away with, and it is one I will never set down again.